How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Great job being here. I know the Super Bowl is still on. We'll be efficient. We should be able to get back and see the end of the game if that interests you relatively easily. I know I promised the second part or the second story on the same theme last night, so I'm going to save that for tomorrow, Monday. It's a great story. I'm just going to save it for tomorrow when, let's say, everyone is here. Who's in the house on a Super Bowl Sunday? Yehuda in South Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Paula in the Great Northwest, Sharon in New Jersey, and it skipped on me, Sharon in New Jersey. Melissa in Great Neck, Shandora in the Bronx, Tom in PA, Guy in Ohio, Marjorie in Georgia, Yitzhak in Minnesota. All right, let's get to it. Our daf today is page 100 here in Tractate Bava Kamma. We're actually going to pick it up toward the bottom of 99b. This page 100 is very short. We're going to go a little further into page 101 to set us up for a double daf tomorrow, which should get us caught up back on schedule. We are continuing our discussion of Mishna number 3 here in chapter 9, and we've been talking about an expert. What is the liability of an expert? And we saw this somewhat counterintuitive holding that if you take your animal to be slaughtered, okay, if you pay for the butcher, the shachet, to do the shechting, the slaughter, and he messes it up, okay, well, if you paid for it, he owes you the value of the animal. If you did it as a favor to you, you didn't pay, it was done for free, very interesting result. If it was an expert, he's not liable for ruining your animal, right? In other words, if it was shechted improperly, so now a Jew can't eat that animal, it's considered a nevela, an unslaughtered carcass, and so not kosher, can't be eaten by a Jew. If an expert makes that mistake, he's not liable. If an ordinary person makes that mistake, he is liable. Now, this is only in the case where you didn't pay, and not according to every view. And basically the reason is, if the expert made such a mistake, it was because some kind of unforeseeable circumstance, the animal jumped, very unusual circumstance. If you paid, he's going to be liable anyway because he should have taken a precaution even against that unusual circumstance. But if it was for free, then he's not liable according to Rav Asi. However, if you take it to an ordinary person, then he is going to be liable. Why? He has less skills. Answer, because he shouldn't have held himself out as a butcher who's doing this. Right now, the assumption is he did something wrong. That's the more likely reason that the shechting was done improperly. Now, continuing the discussion of an expert who made a mistake and caused a loss. It was stated with regard to one who presents a dinar to a money changer to assess its value or authenticity, and the money changer declares it a valid dinar, and it is found to be an invalid dinar, causing its owner a monetary loss. So it is taught in one baraisa that if the money changer is an expert, he is exempt from liability, while if he is an ordinary person, he is liable. So same idea as what I just described about the butcher. And it is taught in another baraisa that irrespective of whether he is an expert or whether he is an ordinary person, he is liable for the loss. So to reconcile these seemingly contradictory baraisas, Rav Papa said when the baraisa teaches that an expert is exempt from liability, it is referring to a renowned expert, such as the money changers Danku and Isur, whose expertise is so great that they do not need to learn about assessing currency at all. And the Gemara asks, but if they are so proficient, why did they make a mistake? And the Gemara answers they erred with regard to a coin from a new press, which at that time was leaving the press, and they did not know its value. They'd never seen it before, and that's why they made the mistake. Now, the Gemara relates there was a certain woman who presented a dinar to Rabbi Chia to assess its authenticity, and he said to her, "It is a proper coin." The next day she came before him and said to him, "Well, I presented it to others and they told me that it was a bad dinar and I am not able to spend it." So Rabbi Chia said to Rav, "Go exchange it for her and write on my tablet, this was a bad transaction as I should not have assessed the coin." So Rabbi Chia is taking responsibility. Now the Gemara asks, but what is different about Danku and Isur, who are exempt due to the fact that they do not need to learn about assessing currency? Rabbi Chia too did not need to learn, as he also was an expert. And the Gemara responds, Rabbi Chia was not actually required to return a dinar to this woman, but when he did so, he acted beyond the letter of the law, and this is as that which Rav Yosef taught concerning the verse, "And you shall show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do," from Exodus 18:20. That was in last week's Torah portion. And the phrase, "and you shall show them," this is referring to the core of their existence, i.e. Torah study, which is the source of life. This way, now we're on 100a, this way, this is referring to acts of kindness. They must walk, this is referring to visiting the sick. Wherein, this is referring to the burial of the dead. The work, this is referring to conducting oneself in accordance with the law. That they must do, this is referring to conducting oneself beyond the letter of the law. And this indicates that the Torah mandates that people conduct themselves beyond the letter of the law. And certainly tzaddikim, right, the righteous ones, and the Torah scholars more than anyone who have to set a good example, they're going to conduct themselves beyond the letter of the law. Very briefly, I just heard a story yesterday on Shabbos. Amazing story. He's been gone for some years, but for a long time, the greatest Torah scholar in America was Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And he was a paskening rabbi. People would bring their questions to him, and his answers were published. And, so much of modern halacha, for American Jews is according to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And he made himself very available. So people were used to calling him, at least when he was younger, and asking questions. And one of his students moved to Israel and forgot that he was calling Rav Moshe in New York, right? And the time change is what he forgot. So when he reached Rav Moshe, it was the middle of the night. He woke him up out of a sound sleep, and he answered, groggily, yes. And the student immediately realized, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot about the time. I shouldn't have called you. I had a question." And Rav Moshe said, "Don't worry. I will answer your question. Just give me a moment." He was getting out of bed. Who knows? Maybe it was 4 a.m. But he's not going to just answer a question. He's going to get himself out of bed, get to his desk. To do that, he has to wash his hands, the morning washing. In a very short time later, he gets on the phone, says, "Yes, what's the question?" The former student now in Israel asked the question, gets the answer. And at the end of the conversation, Rav Moshe said, "What is your address?" In Israel, he gave him the address, and he figured that the reason was that Rav Moshe would have the questions and answers transcribed and sent to the people who ask, and many of them later published. And some weeks go by, and the student receives an envelope in the mail from Rav Moshe, and it's a check. And what was the check for? Because Rav Moshe had called the phone company to find out exactly what was the cost of the call from Israel to New York, and he wanted to reimburse him for the amount of time that he was waiting on the phone while Rav Moshe was washing his own hands and attending to his own needs. Which was outside the scope of getting a halakhic question answered. That's just a level so beyond, but you can see the incredible saintly ethics of Rav Moshe and scholars like him. to hold themselves well beyond the letter of the law, in righteousness, in kindness, in taking care not to ever exploit or misuse the property or time of other people. Very good. So the Gemara relates that Reish Lakish presented a dinar to Rabbi Elazar so that the latter would assess it. And Rabbi Elazar said, it is a proper coin. Reish Lakish said to him, realize that I am relying on you. And Rabbi Elazar said to him, what is the purpose of stating that you are relying on me? Is it so that if this dinar is later found to be invalid, I will be required to exchange it for you with a good dinar? But it is you who said that it is Rabbi Meir who is of the opinion that there is liability for damage caused by indirect action, even if he did not directly cause damage to the property. Right? I didn't take your coin and ruin it in some way, but if I tell you that it's a valid coin and you rely on that, that's going to be indirect action. So what? Is it not that you intended to say, this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, but we do not hold in accordance with his opinion? And Reish Lakish said to him, no, I intended to say that this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and we do hold in accordance with his opinion. So the Gemara asks, which statement of Rabbi Meir is Rabbi Elazar referring to? If we say it is this statement that follows, well, then it is difficult, because there's a problem, and before mentioning what that statement is and why it's difficult, the Gemara will interject a mnemonic device, the letters Dalet, Lamed, Mem, Peh, to help us remember 4 statements of Rabbi Meir that will now be cited. Dan, so Dalet stands for Dan, judgment. Lamed stands for Litzboa, Die, D-Y-E. Mem stands for Misakech, which covers. And the pay is for pirza, which means in this situation broke open. So now the Gemara returns to the matter at hand. As we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Bechoros 28b, if a judge issued a judgment and he made a mistake and he acquitted one who was in fact liable, or he deemed liable one who should have in fact been acquitted, or if he ruled that a pure item is impure, or he ruled that an impure item is pure, and by doing so, he caused a litigant a monetary loss. Okay, so what he did is done, i.e. the judgment stands, and the judge must pay damages from his home, i.e. from his personal funds. He is therefore liable to pay the damages, even though he caused the loss indirectly. That is a standard that judges in a Beis Din are held to that I don't believe American judges on the bench are held to. Now, the Gemara explains why this cannot be the statement of Rabbi Meir that Shmuel was referring to. But wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishnah that Rabbi Ilya says, that Rav says, and this Mishnah is discussing a case where the judge not only issued a ruling, it's not just any time a judge issues a ruling, he's actually personally on the hook if he gets it wrong. He has to go further than that. This is discussing a case where the judge not only issued a ruling, but actively took the money from the one he found liable and gave it to the other party by his own hand. And this is not a case of causation or indirect action, but rather of direct action. So rather, Rabbi Elazar must be referring to this other statement of Rabbi Meir, as we learned in a Mishnah on page 100b, and we have referred to this one a whole bunch of times in the last few days, and we're going to read it tonight. But first we're going to read it here before we get to it. If one gave wool to a dyer to dye it red for him and he dyed it black, or to dye it black and he dyed it red, Rabbi Meir says the dyer gives the owner the value of his wool, not the value of the enhancement. So the Gemara responds, this too does not prove that according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, one is liable even if the loss was brought about by causation rather than direct action, because there he does cause damage through direct action. So rather, Rabbi Elazar must be referring to this other statement of Rabbi Meir, as we learned in a Mishnah, Tractate Kilayim, one who drapes his grapevine atop another person's grain has rendered the grain forbidden due to the prohibition against growing diverse kinds in a vineyard. You can't grow grapevines and wheat in the same plot. You would render them both forbidden for use. And therefore, since he rendered that person's wheat prohibited to use, he is liable to, or he rendered his wheat prohibited to use. So the one who draped his grapevine there is now liable to pay the owner of the grain for the damage. So the Gemara responds, this too does not prove that according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, one is liable even if the loss was brought about by causation rather than direct action, because here too, he does cause damage through direct action. He put the grapevine amidst the wheat. So rather, it must be referring to this other statement of Rabbi Meir. As it is taught in the Tosefta of Kilayim 3:3, if there was a partition of a vineyard that is adjacent to a wheat field, and that partition broke open, now we're on 100b, the owner of the wheat field may tell the owner of the vineyard to repair the breach before the vines intermingle with the grain and cause it to become forbidden. If the partition broke open again, he may tell him to repair it. If the owner of the vineyard abandoned the partition and did not repair it, in other words, he didn't take any action, he has rendered the grain forbidden, and he is obligated to pay restitution for it. And this demonstrates that one is liable to pay damages even if he did not perform any action at all, and consequently proves that Rabbi Meir rules there is liability for damage caused by indirect action. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 9. Now, Mishnah number 4 that we've been hearing about steadily. In the case of one who gives wool to a dyer, and it was burned in the cauldron during the dyeing process, thereby completely ruining the wool so that there is no enhancement. We've been talking about that original case where you give wood to a carpenter and tell him, please fashion a metal box, a jewelry box or a chest or a cabinet for me. And then the question was, once he, takes the wood and works up the cabinet, or let's say the fine jewelry box, and then he ruins it. So what is he liable for? Is he liable just to give back the wood that he received? Or is he liable to pay the price of a finished jewelry box or a nearly finished jewelry box? And this depends on whether he acquires that box while it is in his possession, because of the significant change that he brings upon the wood, the raw materials, through his own effort. And he's going to hand it over once the one who commissioned the box pays for it. But in the meantime, it became his. And therefore, he only owes the value of the wood. Or does he not acquire it? In which case, it remains the property of the owner. And since he ruined a nearly finished box, he does owe the value of the box. And to learn about that, we've been bringing the case of the dyer, right? So the person brings raw wool to the dyer and says, dye it for me. Once this dyeing process is completed, it's going to be more valuable. So if the wool is damaged during that process, it's likened to the case of the wood being turned into a jewelry box. And so what's going to happen? What is the dyer liable for? Does he just have to give the value of the wool that he received? Does he have to give the wool of the value of finished dyed wool? Did he acquire it? Did he not? So in the case of one who gives wool to a dyer and it was burned in the cauldron during the dyeing process, thereby completely ruining the wool so that there is no enhancement, only loss, the dyer gives the owner the value of his wool, not of finished dyed wool, apparently, but rather just the raw wool. If he dyed it unattractively, meaning he dyed it, it just wasn't what the owner was hoping for. If he dyed it unattractively so that the dye is not absorbed well by the wool, well, if the enhancement, i.e. the amount that the value of the wool has increased by being dyed, exceeds the expenses of the dyer in doing that work, then the owner of the wool gives the dyer the value of his expenses, right? What he actually spent out of pocket to dye the raw wool that he received, the owner of the wool has to give him that. And if the expenses exceeded the enhancement, then he gives him just the value of the enhancement. He doesn't have to pay the final price that they agreed to because the one who provided the wool didn't receive what he bargained for, which was properly dyed wool. So the question is, what's the discount going to be? So if the owner gave wool to a dyer to dye it red for him, and instead he dyed it black, or to dye it black and he dyed it red, now he's getting something that's valuable, it's just not according to his taste. So he asked to have it dyed black, it came back red. Or he asked for it to be red and it came out black. So Rabbi Meir says the dyer gives the owner of the wool the value of his wool. Meaning he acquires the dyed wool and he just has to give back the value of the wool, I suppose. And Rabbi Yehuda says here too, if the value of the enhancement exceeds the dyer's expenses, the owner of the wool gives the dyer the expenses, and if the expenses exceed the enhancement, he gives him the value of the enhancement, and I would assume then takes the wool. Now, that's the Mishnah. Here's the Gemara. The Gemara clarifies. So the Gemara clarifies. What does the Mishnah mean when it says unattractively, right? He gave it to be dyed and the dyer did it unattractively. So Rav Nachman said that Rabbi Bar Chana said kelabus. And the Gemara asks, what does kelabus mean? And Rabbi Bar Shmuel said, the sediments of dye in the cauldrons. That is, the dyer took the dye remaining in the cauldron from previous use and used that dye for this garment, leading to an inferior result, right? So inept, incompetent dyeing job is what was done, perhaps due to laziness, perhaps due to lack of resources, but it really was not done right. Now, the sages taught, with regard to one who gives wood to a carpenter to fashion a chair from it, and the carpenter made a bench instead, or one who gives wood to fashion a bench. And now we're on page 101a, by the way. I'm getting a little head start on tomorrow. To fashion a bench, and he fashioned the chair instead. So in these cases, again, it's like you gave wool to be dyed black and it came back red, or vice versa. You were given a competently made product, but it's not what you asked for. So Rabbi Meir says the carpenter gives him the value of his wood, and he keeps the chair or the bench as he has acquired it due to the change, the work that he put into, and which changed the wood into a finished product. It's not what the owner of the wood wanted, so the owner of the wood is going to receive the value of his wood that he gave to the craftsman, and the craftsman is going to keep the bench or chair that the owner of the wood didn't want. So the owner of the wood will have to find more wood and start over, presumably with a different craftsman. Rabbi Yehuda says the craftsman does not acquire them. Rather, if the value of the wood's enhancement exceeds the carpenter's expenses, the owner gives the carpenter the expenses, and if the expenses exceed the enhancement, he gives him the value of the enhancement. Since the carpenter deviated from the customer's order, he is entitled to either his expenses or the enhancement, the smaller of the two, and he can take his wood, which is now fashioned, into a valuable item. Not the item he asked for, but a valuable item. The Baraisa continues, and Rabbi Meir concedes that if he gave wood to a carpenter to fashion a beautiful chair from it, and he fashioned an ugly chair, or to fashion a beautiful bench, and he fashioned an ugly bench, then if the value of the wood's enhancement exceeds the expenses, he gives the value of the expenses, or if the if the expenses exceed the enhancement, the owner of the wood pays the lesser of the value of the time, the increase in value or the actual amount of expenses that the craftsman put into it. The owner of the wood has to pay the smallest amount of those, but he gets the item back. Now, this would again be, he asked for a beautiful bench and he got an ugly bench. He doesn't really want an ugly bench. I suppose he can say, you know what, you keep it. Just give me the value of my wood. He has that option, but he also has the option to take the bench. Now, the craftsman was contracted to make a beautiful bench. He made an ugly bench. Now, you could see that maybe the craftsman doesn't think it's ugly. There would have to be some kind of objective assessment if this came down to a litigation in a Beis Din. Now, since the carpenter, but what says Rabbi Meir, the carpenter did not deviate significantly in the sense that the customer asked for a bench and he got a bench. So it's not like the craftsman just, was asked for black wool and gave red, or was asked for a bench and gave a chair. He was asked for a bench and he gave a bench. It's just not up to the standard that the customer was expecting. So the customer gets a discount. Now, in connection with the discussion of the halakhic, the legal implications of the enhancement of a garment that was quoted above, the Gemara records that there was a dilemma raised before the sages. What is the law? That the enhancement which dye provides to the wool is substantive, i.e. the dye is considered a separate entity from the wool that it dyed, or is the law that the enhancement which dye provides to the wool is not substantive, i.e. the dye does not remain an independent entity and it is viewed as if there is only colored wool? Stay with me, that is a confusing question. It will become clearer. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances in which this dilemma is relevant? If we say that the dilemma arises where one robbed another person of pigments, and he ground them up and soaked them in water, converting them into dye, and then he dyed wool with them, right? The robber just took the powders, which are the actual pigments, turned them into dye, and then dyed wool with them. Now he's going to get caught and he has to make restitution. So what is it that he's got to give back? And he dyed wool with them. So then the dilemma would be concerning how the robber returns the pigments. So in this case, derive the law due to the fact that the robber acquired the pigments as his own due to a change of form which occurred when he ground the pigments into dye. And in any event, he will be obligated to return the value of the pigments at the time that he stole them. That seems pretty straightforward. But the Gemara answers no. It is necessary to resolve the dilemma in a different case, where one robbed another person of pigments that had already been soaked in water and been transformed into dye, and then he dyed wool with them. So he didn't take raw pigments, he took pigments that had already been turned into dye. So he stole dye, and he then dyed wool with it. Okay, so what is the law here? Is the enhancement which dye provides to the wool substantive, meaning it is a separate entity, so that the owner can say to the robber, give me my dyes that you took? Or perhaps the enhancement which dye provides to the wool is not substantive, but becomes one with the wool, so that the robber can say to the owner, I have nothing at all of yours, since the dyes are no longer considered extant. They don't exist. I'll give you the money, what they were worth when I took them, but I can't possibly restore to you the actual item that I took because the dye has been incorporated into the wool, right? Or could we say the other view and say, well, no, the dye still exists. Okay, it's in the wool. Give me the dyed wool. I'll pay for the wool, but my dye is in that wool, and so I want the dyed wool. Or does the robber say, yeah, your dye just doesn't exist anymore. It's been incorporated in the wool. That's just something totally different. I'll pay you for what I took, what it was worth when I took it. So the Gemara answers, wait a minute. Right. So the Gemara rejects this understanding of the application of the dilemma. The sages say, and even if the enhancement which dye provides to the wool is not substantive, can the robber really say to him, I have nothing at all of yours? Let the owner say to him, give me my dyes that you have caused to be lost. Even if the dyes are no longer considered extant, the owner is still entitled to monetary compensation for the robbery, which seems obvious. So rather, the dilemma is relevant to a different set of circumstances. It's to the other side of the question. Is the law that the enhancement which dye provides to the wool, is it the law that the enhancement which the dye provides is not substantive, and therefore the robber needs to pay him? Or perhaps the enhancement which dye provides to the wool is substantive, and the robber can say to the owner of the dyes that he stole from, so the dyes absorbed into the wool lie before you. Take them. Right? So it's not like it's obvious that he has the option to pay, right? At a minimum, he has to do that. But does the robber have the option to say, here's your dye that I took from you. Now it's incorporated in this wool, but it's still identifiable as your dyes. So take it. Take it as in the form of dyed wool. Can he do that? Or is it so different that the owner says, I don't want dyed wool. I had dyes. I was going to use it for my own wool, which is finer wool. I don't want your crummy dyed wool. Give me the value of what you took from me. And the Gemara rejects this as well. Take them. With what would he take the dyes? With soap? Right? In other words, I don't want your dyed wool. I want my dye. And can I remove my dye from your wool that you incorporated into? That won't work. While soap does remove dye from the wool, it does not return the dye to the robbery victim. The dye cannot be recovered. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara suggests another scenario. Rather, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where he robbed one person of wool and dyes, and he dyed that wool with those dyes, and he's returning the dyed wool to him. Very odd case, right? We're definitely getting into that realm of hypothetical case to test our understanding of the law. But okay, imagine it. So somebody had both wool and dye, and he was going to dye it. The thief took both the wool and the dye. And then he said, well, what am I going to do with these things? I guess I'm going to dye the wool, and then I'll sell it. But in the meantime, he got caught. So he has to make restitution. Okay, so now what? So he robbed one person of both the wool and the dyes, and he dyed that wool with those dyes. And now he is returning the dyed wool to its original owner. And the dilemma is the law that the enhancement which dye provides to the wool is substantive, and he's therefore returning both the dye and the wool to its owner? Or perhaps the enhancement which the dye provides to the wool is not substantive, and it is only the wool that he is returning to him, but he is not returning the dye to him since it no longer exists. He is returning dyed wool to him, but maybe he wanted it dyed a different way. So really what he's getting back is his wool, now changed, maybe with increased value, and he's not getting his dye back. So does the robber still owe the value of the dye even though he's returning the dyed wool? But the Gemara rejects this understanding of the application of our dilemma as well. The sages say, derive the law in this case based on the fact that he increased the value of the wool for the owner, as dyed wool is more expensive than undyed wool. So consequently, even if the robber has not returned the dye, he reimburses the owner for it by returning the appreciated wool. And the Gemara suggests, no. Actually, we're talking about a different set of circumstances, and it is necessary to resolve the dilemma in a case where the cost of the dye has depreciated. If the dye is viewed as an independent entity, the robber is returning both the wool and the dye. But if it is not, he must reimburse the robbery victim for the value of the dye at the time of the robbery. And if you wish, say instead, the dilemma is relevant in a case where he robbed another of dye and a basket, and dyed the basket with the dye, in which case the dye does not increase the value of the dyed item. The color basket is not worth more than the undyed basket. That's where we're going to knock off, and we're going to continue that discussion. And please God, I'm going to tell you the story of Akiva and Aryeh and the lengths they went to eat matzah in the most difficult of circumstances tomorrow at the regular Monday time of 6 p.m. Pacific. Just have one question and one comment I see. Bill says, oh dear, that's a frightful thought. What if the craftsman and the customer have very different aesthetic sensibilities? I'm not a fan of brutalist architecture, but there are many who are. If a contractor then built me a brutalist house when I was expecting a Queen Anne, would it come down to the aesthetic senses of the Beit Din? I think that there's going to be more factors involved. I think, were the raw materials enhanced when something was built, and what is that worth? Okay. But they're not going to say, well, take the brutalist architecture, Bill. Other people like it, maybe you don't, but sadly, that's what you've got, now live in it. They're not going to tell you that. Right? They're not going to tell you that, I'm sure of that. But we're really just discussing is what are the damages that are going to be due that doesn't include all the possibilities for disposition of the case. That's my impression. Nina also says, say hi to newcomer Max Gordon, a young man who is interested in learning more about Judaism and his Jewish heritage. Max, great to have you with us. We're here every day. This is not an easy subject to join in on as a first time, but if you stay with it, things will get clearer and clearer. That's what I've got for us today, and God willing, see you all tomorrow. All the best.